Mrs. Honey had a hat. On Monday, she wore it when she took her grandson Peter to the park. She bought him some bubble gum and sat on the bench with her knitting. Peter thought, those feathers would make my arrows fly better. So he pulled the feathers off the hat, and his bubble gum stuck to the brim. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Tuesday, Mrs. Honey wore her hat to visit a friend. They sat in the garden in the shade of a tree and ate cakes. Some birds flew down to pick up the crumbs. Those cherries look good, they chirped. So they flew off with them. One little bird left some eggs behind, but Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Wednesday, Mrs. Honey spent the day at the seaside. The sun shone and the water was just right for paddling. Mrs. Honey felt very happy. Afterwards, Mrs. Honey took off her hat and sat in the sun. A hermit crab thought that shell would make a nice new home, so he scuttled away with the shell and left some seaweed behind. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Thursday, Mrs. Honey picked dandelions to make wine. It was very hard work. She took off her hat and put it on the fence. A cow in the field saw the hat on the fence. What beautiful big buttercups! She moved. So she took a mouthful and her bell fell onto Mrs. Honey's hat. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Friday, Mrs. Honey went to see an old castle. Just look at those cobwebs, exclaimed Mrs. Honey. This place would do with a good clean. A big black spider dropped onto her hat. Hooray, he said. This lace will make a good strong cobweb. So he hurried away with the lace and left all his old webs behind. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Saturday, Mrs. Honey took her cat to a cat show. There were all sorts of fine cats, but she hoped that hers would win first prize. An alley cat stole Mrs. Honey's hat through the window. That ribbon might help me to win first prize, he thought. So he pulled it from the hat and left some fish bones behind. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Sunday, Mrs. Honey went to church. Everyone seemed to be staring at her. Whatever can it be? She wondered. Perhaps it's time I bought a new hat. After the service, Mr. Honey hurried home to look in the mirror. Then she noticed the bubble gum, the eggs, the seaweed, the bell, the cobwebs, and the fish bones. Goodness! She exclaimed. I've got a new hat, but she wasn't sure that she'd like it. Thanks for watching. The end.